Hi, this is Kendall Boyson, professional life and recovery coach, and you're listening to Encouragementology, the practice of instilling hope. Hi there. Thanks for joining me. On this show, we are exploring the power of the B-side perspective and why sometimes the idea that changes everything is the one we almost ignored. Have you ever been absolutely convinced you were right about something, only to realize later there was another way to see it? Maybe it was a disagreement with a coworker where you thought they just don't get it. Maybe it was feedback that rubbed you the wrong way. Maybe it was a situation where you felt stuck and kept circling the same explanation over and over. You keep playing the same mental record, same story, same interpretation, same conclusion. And the strange thing is, most of us don't even realize we're doing it. Before streaming and playlists, music came on vinyl records. A record had two sides, the A side and the B side. The A side was the hit. It was the song the record company believed in, the one they promoted, the one everyone expected to succeed. The B side was the other track. Sometimes it was experimental. Sometimes it was recorded quickly at the end of a session. Sometimes the label barely paid attention to it at all. But every now and then, something unexpected happened. People flipped the record, and they discovered the B-side song was actually the one that changed everything. In fact, some of the most iconic songs in music history started as B-sides. Songs that almost went unnoticed until someone listened from a different angle. I love that idea because life works that way too. We all have A-side thinking. It's our first interpretation of a situation. It's the explanation that feels obvious, the conclusion we arrive at quickly and confidently. The customer is difficult. This plan will not work. They aren't listening. This is just the way things are. The A side feels solid, familiar, safe. But sometimes the thing we're most certain about is just the version of the story. The B side perspective is different. It asks a question most of us skip. What if there's another explanation? What if the frustration you keep experiencing has another angle? What if the problem you keep trying to fix has a different root? What if the opportunity you're chasing is not actually the best one available? And here's the interesting part. Flipping the record doesn't mean your first idea is wrong. It simply means it might not be the only idea. Today, I want to explore what happens when we get curious enough to flip the record in our thinking. Not just in business, not just in problem solving, but in the stories we tell ourselves about other people, about situations, and sometimes even about ourselves. Because sometimes the breakthrough you're waiting for is sitting quietly on the B side. And all it takes to find it is the willingness to turn the record over. So let's start by defining what we mean when we talk about the B side. The B-side perspective is simply the angle you didn't consider first. It's the interpretation that sits just outside your initial explanation. When something happens in our lives, our brain almost instantly creates a story about it. We explain it to ourselves so that we can move on quickly. That explanation is the A side. The A side is your first conclusion, your first assumption, your first explanation of what's happening. And it sounds like this. They are being difficult. This idea will never work. That customer just doesn't understand. This situation is unfair. The A side is fast. It's confident. It feels logical because it's the first story our brain produces. But our brains are designed to simplify information. They look for patterns, shortcuts, and familiar explanations so we can process the world efficiently. And that is useful until it limits us, because the first explanation is not always the most complete one. That's where the B side comes in. The B-side perspective asks a different question. Instead of asking, what is the answer? It asks, what else could be true? It's curiosity replacing certainty. For example, imagine a situation where a customer keeps asking the same question over and over. The A-side explanation might be, they're not paying attention. But the B-side question might be, is our communication actually clear? Or maybe think about a situation where someone disagrees with you. The A side might say, they're wrong. But the B side might ask, what are they seeing that I'm not? Or here's one we all experience. You send a message and someone doesn't respond. The A side says, they're ignoring me. The B side says, maybe they're busy. Maybe they're thinking. Maybe the timing just wasn't right. The interesting thing about the B side is that it doesn't always change the outcome. Sometimes the A side explanation is actually correct. But the value of flipping the record is not about proving yourself wrong. It's about widening your perspective. Because the moment you consider the B side, something powerful happens. You move from reaction to reflection. You stop defending your first explanation and start exploring possibilities. And that shift alone can change how we approach problems, how we respond to people, and even how we understand ourselves. The B-side perspective is not about abandoning your instincts. It's about giving curiosity a seat at the table. Because sometimes the idea that moves you forward is not the first one you heard. It's the one you discovered when you flipped the record. Now, here's the interesting part about all of this. Our brains actually prefer the A side. There is a psychological reason for that. Our minds are designed to make quick sense of the world. We take in enormous amounts of information every day, so the brain relies on shortcuts to process things efficiently. One of those shortcuts is something psychologists call confirmation bias. Confirmation bias simply means that once we form an opinion or explanation, we start looking for evidence that supports it. So if you decide someone is difficult, you begin noticing every difficult thing they do. If you decide an idea will not work, your brain quickly finds reasons why it will fail. If you believe something is unfair, your mind gathers examples that reinforce that belief. It's not intentional. It's just how the brain works. Once the A side starts playing, our brain tends to keep replaying the same track. But here's where things get interesting. Many breakthroughs happen when someone interrupts that pattern. Organizational psychologist Adam Grant has studied what he calls original thinkers. These are the people who challenge assumptions and come up with ideas that move things forward. What he found was fascinating. They're not necessarily the loudest people in the room, and they're not always the most confident either. What they're really good at is questioning the obvious. They ask questions that most people skip. Questions like, what if we're solving the wrong problem? What if the opposite is true? What are we assuming right now? Those are B-side questions. They don't immediately reject the A side, but they refuse to stop there. History is full of examples like this. Many of the most famous songs in history were actually B-sides. Songs that the record label didn't believe in. songs that were recorded quickly because time was almost up in the studio. Gloria Gaynor's song, I Will Survive, was originally the B-side to another track before becoming one of the most iconic empowerment songs ever recorded. And the song, Rock Around the Clock, was recorded almost as an afterthought in a short window at the end of a recording session, yet it became one of the most defining songs of early rock and roll. The point is not just musical trivia. The point is that sometimes the idea people are less confident about ends up being the one that resonates the most. And this shows up everywhere in life. In business, it happens when companies ignore customer feedback because it doesn't fit their current strategy. In relationships, it happens when we assume we understand someone's behavior without asking a deeper question. In personal growth, it happens when we hold tightly to a story about who we are. I'm not good at that. That opportunity is not for me. That's just how I am. The A side can become a script we repeat, but the B side invites curiosity. It invites us to step back and ask a simple but powerful question. What might I be missing? That question alone can change the direction of a conversation, a decision, or even a life. Because sometimes the difference between staying stuck and moving forward is not a brand new solution. It's a new perspective, and that perspective often lives on the B side. Let's try something together. I want you to think of something in your life right now that feels frustrating. It might be something at work, a situation with a customer or a coworker, maybe something in a relationship, or even a goal that feels stuck. Just pick one thing. Now, ask yourself the first question. What is the problem? That seems simple, but it's important to name it clearly. Maybe the problem sounds like this. My customers keep asking the same questions. My team doesn't understand what I'm saying. This project is moving slower than I expected. Someone in my life keeps reacting in a way that frustrates me. Now, here comes the A side. What story are you telling yourself about the problem? Maybe the story sounds like this. They're not paying attention. They're being difficult. They don't care. This will never change. That story feels logical because it's the explanation your brain created first. But now we're going to flip the record. Ask yourself the B-side question. What might be another explanation? Maybe the customers are asking the same question because your communication is not as clear as you thought. Maybe the team is confused because they're hearing something different than what you intended. Maybe the project is slow because the real obstacle is somewhere you haven't looked yet. Maybe the person who frustrates you is reacting to something you're not aware of. The B side doesn't guarantee that your first explanation is wrong, but it invites curiosity before certainty. And curiosity is powerful because when you get curious instead of defensive, something shifts. We listen differently. We ask better questions. We see things we might have missed the first time. Sometimes the B side simply gives us more compassion for the people around us. Sometimes it reveals a blind spot. And sometimes it unlocks a completely new path forward. But none of that happens unless we pause long enough to flip the record. And that simple pause can change everything. So now we understand the idea of the B-side. The next question becomes practical. How do we actually do this? Because recognizing that another perspective exists is one thing. Training ourselves to look for it is something else entirely. The good news is that the B-side thinking is not complicated. It's simply a habit of curiosity. Let me share a few ways you can start practicing it in real life. The first is to pause before you lock in the story. Remember, our brains move quickly. The moment something happens, we instinctively assign meaning to it. Someone doesn't respond to your email. A client pushes back on an idea. A coworker seems short with you. And immediately, the A side begins playing. They're ignoring me. They don't like my idea. They're upset with me. But before you decide that explanation is the truth, pause and ask yourself a simple question. What else could this mean? Maybe they're just overwhelmed. Maybe they misunderstood something. Maybe they're dealing with something you can't see. That pause doesn't make you naive. It makes you thoughtful. The second way to practice B-side thinking is invite curiosity into conversations. When we feel certain about our interpretation, we often stop asking questions. But questions are where the B-side lives. Instead of assuming, try something like this. Help me understand how you're seeing this. Tell me more about what led you to that idea. What am I missing here? Those kinds of questions open doors. They turn disagreement into discovery, and what you learn changes the entire tone of the conversation. The third way is challenge your own internal narratives. Many of the strongest A-sides we carry are not about other people. They're about ourselves. Stories like, I'm not good at that. I always mess this up. That opportunity is for someone else. These are powerful agreements we make with ourselves. But sometimes those stories were formed years ago in moments that no longer represent who we are today. The B-side might sound like this. What if I'm more capable than I think? What if I'm still learning? What if this opportunity is exactly how I grow? That shift in thinking can quietly open doors we never thought to try. And finally, the fourth practice is surround yourself with people who think differently than you do. It's comfortable to spend time with people who see the world the same way we do. But growth usually happens when we encounter new perspectives, different experiences, different backgrounds, different ways of solving problems. Those voices help us hear the B-sides we might never discover on our own. Because sometimes the B-side is not hidden. It's simply coming from someone sitting across the table from you. And when you're open to those perspectives, our thinking expands. Not because we abandon who we are and what we believe, but because we allow our understanding to grow. And that kind of flexibility is where real progress begins. Let me share a story with you. There was once a group of travelers hiking through a mountain pass. The path wound through the forest and climbed steadily upward. Along the way, the group began debating what the mountain ahead of them looked like. One traveler said, "It's clearly a rocky mountain. I can see the sharp cliffs and the stone faces from here." Another traveler disagreed. "No, you're wrong. The mountain is covered in trees. Look at that thick forest climbing all the way up the side." The third traveler joined in. "You're both mistaken. The mountain is mostly snow. I can see the white caps shining in the sun. The debate grew louder as they continued walking. Each person became more confident in what they believed they were seeing. Eventually, they reached a small clearing where an old guide was resting before the trail. The travelers eagerly asked him to settle the argument. "What kind of mountain is this?" they asked. "Is it rock, forest, or snow?" The guide smiled. "All of you are correct." The travelers looked confused. "That's impossible," one of them replied. "We can't all be right." The guide stood and pointed behind them. "You approach the mountain from 3 different sides," he explained. "The north side is covered in snow. The eastern side is dense forest. The western side is steep rock." Then he added something simple but powerful. The mountain didn't change. Only your perspective did. And suddenly, the argument felt very different. Each traveler had been describing what they genuinely saw, but none of them could see the whole mountain. And that's often how perspective works in our lives. We see the one side of the mountain and assume it's the entire landscape. But every situation has multiple sides. Each person carries a different vantage point. Every challenge contains details we may not see yet. The B-side perspective reminds us of something important. Just because something looks a certain way from where we stand doesn't mean it's the whole story. Sometimes growth begins when we simply walk around the mountain. That story about the mountain reminds us of something simple but powerful. Most of the time, we're not arguing about facts. We're describing the side of the mountain we happen to be standing on. And that realization can be incredibly freeing. When we understand that perspective plays a role in almost every situation, we become less defensive and more curious. Instead of trying to prove we're right, we can start asking better questions. Instead of assuming we see the whole picture, we can allow space for something new. This is a great place to pause and reflect. And if you enjoy going deeper with these ideas, remember there's always the 5-day journaling companion available for download in the show notes that walks you through this topic step by step. You can absolutely write these things down in a journal, but you can also simply sit with the questions and reflect. Sometimes just thinking through them is powerful enough. So let's explore together. One, where in your life might you currently be standing on only one side of the mountain? What situation or relationship immediately comes to mind? What story have you been telling yourself about it? What might the other side of the mountain look like? 2. Think about the last time you strongly disagreed with someone. What was your immediate reaction in that moment? What might they have been seeing or experiencing that you couldn't see? How might curiosity have changed that conversation? 3. Consider a belief you carry about yourself. What is a statement you often repeat internally about who you are and what you can do? Where did that belief originally come from? What might the B side of that belief sound like? 4. Think about a situation where you felt misunderstood. What perspective were you hoping others would see? What might their view of the situation have been? Is there something you might understand differently today? 5. Reflect on a time when changing your perspective made a situation better. What helped you see things differently? How did that shift change your reaction or decision? What does that experience teach you about the power of perspective? Take a moment to sit with whichever of these questions speaks to you the most. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs don't come from finding the right answer. They come from asking a better question. So let's take a step back for a moment and look at what we uncovered together. We started with a simple idea that most of us have experienced without realizing it. Life often plays like a record. There is the A side, the story that comes to us first. It's the explanation our brain reaches for, the interpretation that feels obvious and certain. And then there's the B side, the perspective we don't always hear right away, the possibility that there is more to the story than we initially see. Our brains naturally prefer the A side. It feels efficient. It feels familiar. It helps us move quickly through the world. But the danger is that when we stay on that one track, we can miss important information. We can misunderstand people. We can limit our own thinking. So today, we explored what happens when we pause long enough to flip the record. When we ask questions like, what might I be missing? What else could this mean? What might someone else be seeing from their side of the mountain? We talked about how perspective doesn't require us to abandon our own beliefs. It simply invites us to expand them. Sometimes the B side helps us see another person with more compassion. And sometimes it helps us challenge a belief we've carried about ourselves. It can also reveal opportunities we might have overlooked. The goal is not to second guess everything in your life. The goal here is awareness. Awareness of the stories we quickly create. Awareness that every situation has more than one vantage point. The truth is, the mountain never changes, but our view of it can. And when our perspective shifts, our understanding of the world shifts right along with it. If you want to share Encouragementology with a friend who needs to know they're not alone in this journey of self-discovery, you can visit Encouragementology.com or anywhere you stream your content to receive this episode and all others. Check out the show notes for the 5-day journaling companion and follow us on Facebook and Instagram for additional encouragement throughout the week. So I challenge you. This week, flip the record once before locking in your conclusion. When you catch yourself certain about a situation, pause and ask, what might the B side be? Give yourself permission to consider another angle, not to abandon your perspective, but to expand it. I know you can do it. Thank you for listening to Encouragementology with Kendall Boyson, where we find positive ways to handle some of life's challenges.
I stumbled through until the path was clear. That's when I found you and how I wound up here.